It is really about how much we have been able to give back to the universe. There are many ways in which you can give back. But there is one way by which the most intelligent give back. It's through innovation. Innovations are needed to solve the most challenging problems that we face. Challenges in the areas of sustainability, technology, education, energy, life sciences. Express your intelligence by solving some of the big challenges we face, and you will become innovation.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. We set sail on this new sea because there is new knowledge to be gained and new rights to be won, and they must be won and used for the progress of all mankind. We shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food, and survival, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, fellow IITians, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Malik Pucha, and I am a retired senior systems engineer and project management specialist that has worked on NASA contractor community projects for over 30 years. It's a great honor to introduce a national hero and space pioneer to this distinguished audience in the energy, space, medical sciences, and soon to be the educational capital of the world. For those of us who worked in the space industry and those who have watched Apollo 13 movie, Gene Kranz does not need an introduction. For the remaining, Kranz is best known for the leader of the Tiger team of flight directors who brought the Apollo 13 spaceship safely back to Earth on April 17, 1970, and Gene demonstrated extraordinary courage and heroism. You can get the rest of the details on the conference website. Apollo 13 turned out to be one of the space program's proudest moments. What could have been a horrible disaster turned out to be a great achievement. Gene, I just want to provide a pointer about the audience you are about to address. Most of us in this room choose to go to an IIT. We choose to go to an IIT not because it is easy, but it is hard. We went on to the top and leading schools in this country for our further education. So it is not a stretch if I say that this group represents the most extraordinary collection of talents and IQ comparable to the collection of Nobel laureates that JFK had in the White House on April 29, 1962. So, you may need to make a delta correction to your planned level of presentation at L-1 minute and counting. I am sure you can handle it. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give the great IITians welcome to Gene Kranz on Pearl Harbor Day. Thank you.
Good evening. I thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight on the men and the women of mission control. You know, when Jim Lovell called down from the spacecraft, "Hey, Houston, we got a problem," all I had were my teams in mission control and a learning curve that started about 10 years earlier at a place called Cape Canaveral. At that time, the Cape was nothing but marsh, saltgrass, corrugated steel buildings, and antennas. And it was there we learned of leadership, trust, values, and teamwork. Mission Control is an incredible leadership laboratory where we teach our young controllers to achieve excellence. Excellence as an individual, as a team member, and as a leader. And there they learn the difference between the I and the we part of the team, because when their time comes, we need our controllers to step forward, assume a leadership role, make their contribution, and then return to the ranks within a team. Our work develops chemistry because chemistry in any organization is a force amplifier. It amplifies the individual's talent as well as the team's talent. And chemistry leads to communication in our line of work that is virtually intuitive, because we must know when the person next to us needs help or a few more seconds to come up with an answer. And in mission control, there's no such thing as a first team, because once we launch, every team must be capable of accomplishing the mission. And finally, when we must act alone, and we know that time will come to each of us, we are never alone, because we know our team stands with us. In our work, failure is not an option. When we started in 1960, our world was vastly different. Our nation would soon be torn by the beginning of the conflict in Vietnam. During that decade, we had 3 political assassinations, and the civil rights movement was just emerging within the nation. The Cold War with the Soviet Union provided the stimulus for the space program that guided every aspect of America's foreign policy. Computers only existed in laboratories. There were no global communications, and in that decade, American students would riot in the campuses. And then in 1961, a young, brash, and articulate President John F. Kennedy issued a challenge. He said, "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." And when he issued this challenge, we were struggling to put a spacecraft into orbit. 1 month prior to the speech, we had blown up our second Atlas rocket. 9 days prior to the speech, we had launched Alan Shepard. So we had a total of 20 minutes manned spaceflight experience. We'd never been to orbit, and we were challenged to put a man on the moon. So engineers and people experienced in flight test and a small group of 31 Canadians and Englishmen joined with the Mercury 7 astronauts at Langley Field in Virginia to form a space task group that would win supremacy in space. Our boss was Walt Williams. Walt was the toughest man I have ever known. He was a brawler. He is more fitted to working as a longshoreman in New York or New Orleans or San Diego than leading the American space program. But in the business of aircraft flight test, Williams was a legend. He was a pioneer director of the NACA high-speed test station that today we call Edwards Air Force Base. And is a project manager for the X-1 rocket ship that in 1947 took Chuck Yeager and the world into the age of supersonic flight. Williams' deputy was prophetically named Christopher Columbus Kraft. Chris was the pioneer of early spaceflight operations. He developed the concept under which we'd operate, launched each one of the Mercury missions, but most importantly, he was the mentor, the teacher, the tutor. For the first generation of young people, it became known as mission controllers. Mercury Control did not have a single computer. There were only 3 mainframe computers supporting all of Project Mercury. 2 of these mainframes were located at Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, 600 miles north of the Cape, at Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. That was the first solid-state machine ever produced by IBM. On the island of Bermuda, we put a reliable vacuum tube computer, and we always launched eastward over the island, such that if we had communications problems during powered flight, the team in place would tell the astronaut what to do when the engine shut down. Global communications consist of a 60-word-per-minute teletype network that dated back to the days of America's Pony Express. So after a couple weeks training in spacecraft systems and operations, and after we all became very proficient in Morse code, we sent young men to 13 tracking stations around the world. They went into the heart of Africa, they went to Zanzibar, they went to Australia, ships at sea, islands in the Pacific. And these were sites that were literally at the ends of the earth. And the risk to these young people is very high because the 60s was the end of the European colonial period. My controllers in Kano, Nigeria were twice rescued by the Army. At Zanzibar, we'd work under the protection of the Gordon Highlanders of the Queen's Royal Rifles, who would surround the tracking station during contact periods and bring the controllers back to the quarters at night. It became so violent at that site that we shut it down after only 3 years, but these young people at the sites were eyes, ears, and voice. As the spacecraft passed overhead, and for their age, they were given incredible responsibilities, and they grew to be the leaders of Apollo. I first ventured into space in Project Mercury, and each one of our launches was a chapter in the history book of spaceflight. Our mistakes were violent, they were brutal, they were visible. 2 of our first 3 Atlas rockets exploded shortly after they left the launch pad. Then we launched our first Redstone rocket. The engine got ignited, lifted 4 inches off the launch pad, then the engine shut down. Through some miracle, the rocket landed back upright in the launch stand. The escape tower fired, went up to about 4,000 feet, came plummeting down at the viewing stand. The senators and congressmen ran for cover. Our rocket engineers were speaking in German. We didn't understand what they're saying. We literally did not know what to do. But we were fortunate in those days because our nation understood there is no achievement without risk. And there certainly weren't any guarantees in this new business called spaceflight. We put 6 Americans in space in our first 2 years, and there were close calls on every one of those missions, especially in John Glenn's and Scotty Carpenter's. But we got every one of our crewmen home. And by the time that we had finished with Project Mercury, we had learned that man could live and could perform in space. But we learned much more. We learned of leaders and leadership. Leaders have integrity. They're teachers, they're team builders. And when there's trouble, leaders are out front. We also learn a lot about ourselves as individuals because in those days, many of us came in from aircraft flight test, and our egos were much bigger than this room. And it was tough at times to get people to work together. But we knew that success would only come as a team, so we became one. And we learned to check our ego at the door every day when we came to work. So we moved into the Gemini program, and Gemini was designed to develop and test and prove the technologies we needed in order to go to the moon. One of these technologies related to the tools and the techniques we used in designing our mission trajectories. During Project Mercury for trajectory design, we had a very large group of women, about 100 of them. They were all mathematicians, and we called these women computers. Computers were people to us in the early days, not machines. And these women would travel with us from our headquarters at Langley Field in Virginia down to the Cape for each one of the launches, and they'd bring calculators along. They'd get down at the Cape, they'd punch away at the numbers, they'd write the answers down, they would plot it in graph paper, and these women would do this endlessly, day after day, just to design a single Mercury trajectory. Well, this approach wasn't going to get us to the moon. It wouldn't even get 2 spacecrafts rendezvoused in Gemini, so we finally did get computers. And each one of these machines was as big as a house. 5 of them filled the entire first floor in our new Mission Control Center in Houston, and even put a small 4,000-word computer on board the Gemini spacecraft. But the problem was we had no computer experience. So I went to the colleges and universities throughout our nation and brought in the young people who were working with computers and laboratories. We went to the Army Missile Command at Fort Bliss in Texas and brought in the corporals and sergeants. They were discharged because the Army had been working with computers in the Ground-Air Missile Program. And we took these new recruits and merged them with the Mercury veterans. And we started working in the very edge of all knowledge, all technology, and all experience. Now, when we first started off in space, the Soviet Union had about a 2.5-year lead on us. But when Ed White stepped outside the spacecraft on the Gemini 4 mission, we had now narrowed that lead down to mere months. And then on the next 2 missions, for the first time, we set American manned spaceflight records. First for mission duration, and then we rendezvoused 2 spacecrafts. And when we had accomplished this rendezvous, we had developed the technologies we needed to reach further into space. And we had the confidence to use these new technologies, but we continued to learn of ourselves and of our work. We learned of discipline, a focus so intense upon the objective that we would never do anything personally that would compromise achieving that objective. And we found the benefit of high morale because we now knew we were succeeding because of our beliefs in our mission, our team, and in ourselves. So we moved into the Apollo program. We were in the consoles in Mission Control Friday afternoon, January 27th, 1967. 1 month from launch, testing the Apollo Command and Service Module. Crew members were Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. We had worked with Gus and Ed in the Mercury and the Gemini program, and Roger was a Navy rookie preparing for his first space flight. But he was already pretty well known within our ranks because he is one of the pilots who took the pictures over Cuba during the missile crisis. The test that Friday hadn't been going very well. We had problems with communications. We had problems with life support. Crew reported noxious odor inside the spacecraft, and the test procedures just didn't hang together. And we struggled through that afternoon, frequently calling a halt in the countdown, sorting out problems, and then continuing on. And at 6:27 that evening, we again shut the countdown down before we transferred from external power in the launch pad to internal power in the spacecraft. And 4 minutes after entering that countdown hold, we were startled by screams coming from our crew. And we listened to our crew's screams for 18 seconds as they died. And with their death came anger. Anger at ourselves because we knew we were responsible for America's first space disaster. And we wrote 2 more words into our vocabulary as mission controllers: tough and competent. Tough meaning we will never again shirk from our responsibilities because we are forever accountable for what we do, or in the case of Apollo 1 and our crew, what we failed to do. Competent, we'll never again take anything for granted. We will never stop learning. From now on, the teams and mission control will be perfect. And we designed the badge, the emblem of the mission control team, and the price for admission to our ranks and to wear this lapel pin. Discipline, morale, toughness, competence, commitment, teamwork. because as a team, we must never fail. Now in our line of work, the boss is the flight director. He has a very simple job description. It is only one sentence long. And it says, the flight director may take any actions necessary for crew safety and mission success. During the course of a mission, there is no higher authority. And the flight director is supported by a team of between 15 and 21 controllers. People specialize in trajectories and spacecraft systems. We have facility operators, we have planners, we have procedures writers. We have a medical doctor who looks after the ground team as well as the crew in space. And we have an astronaut who provides communications during the course of the mission. And mission controllers are young. They're generally in their early to the mid-20s. Flight directors are in their early to the mid-30s. And this team on the screen right now, whose average age is 26, is the team that in July 20th, 1969, took Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and the world to the surface of the moon, and we literally fought every step of the way to get there. When we finally shut the engine down on the lunar surface that day, we had less than 17 seconds of fuel remaining, and we were in the process of counting down to a very difficult and very risky land abort decision. But when we shut that engine down and the crew walked on the surface, and when they lifted off and we got those guys back home, we had fulfilled the pledge that we had made to our now dead President John F. Kennedy and the crew of Apollo 1. We launched again in November. As we left the launch pad, we were hit twice by lightning. We had 3 crewmen inside dead spacecraft thundering up towards orbit. The only thing working was booster propulsion and booster guidance. And mission control had 2 minutes to save that mission. We voiced the instructions up to the crew to seek out a very obscure switch that would restore backup telemetry. With the telemetry online, the team could get to work. We verified reactants were flowing into the fuel cells. We brought the fuel cells back online in the power system. We secured the navigation system. Everything kept working. Got the spacecraft up into orbit, checked it out, and 2.5 hours later, we give the crew the go for translunar injection. So by the time we got to Apollo 13, this was our 3rd lunar landing mission. The 2 prior missions had been pretty sporty, and we were hoping for a change. This mission would go a lot smoother for us. Our crew members were Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Ken Mattingly. Lovell and Hayes were the crew in the lunar module, and they were scheduled to descend to a very rugged landing site on the moon that we called Frau Maro. Ken Mattingly was the command module pilot. He'd remain in the spacecraft circling the moon, but 4 days prior to launch, he was scrubbed from the mission because he had been exposed to measles. It is replaced by Jack Swigert, a member of the backup crew. The mission's run in thrust. When you turn 7.5 million pounds of thrust loose with the Saturn V, that is commitment. There's no changing your mind and no turning back from that decision. And trust allows you to make the split-second decisions, very rapidly seek out every option that may exist. We lost an engine during the 2nd stage of powered flight. Very quickly, we looked at the remaining 4 engines. They were all go. We computed the new engine shutdown times, verified we had enough propellant to get the crew up into orbit, checked the spacecraft out, and 2.5 hours later, we give the crew the go for translunar injection. So now by the end of the 2nd day, this crew is 200,000 miles from Earth. They're 50,000 miles from the surface of the moon. We're entering a phase of the mission. We use the term entering into the lunar sphere of influence. And this is the point in the mission where you cross over from the Earth's gravity to the moon's gravity. And for a short period of time of 4 hours, you have 2 mission abort options. One comes around the front side of the moon, takes a day and a half to return to Earth. The other option takes us around the moon, takes between 4 and 5 days to get home. But you got to make up your mind quick because time and these options is running out. My team was on the console and mission control. We were just finishing our 2nd shift, and everything was looking pretty good. During the shift, we had had a television broadcast from the crew. And during the broadcast, the crew's wives and families had been sitting behind me in the viewing room. When we secured the television link, families went home, and now in my main control room, the noise level was building up. And the next team of controllers had reported in for shift handover. Their flight director was Glenn Lunny. He was the leader of the black team. We used colors to identify teams in those days. He was sitting next to me reading my log. The final thing my team had to do is to put the crew to sleep. We have a 5-page pre-sleep checklist we go through very carefully to make sure everything's properly configured before we start the sleep period. We got down to the final item, and the final item asked a question. Do we require a cryo stir? Now, the fuels we use on board the spacecraft are cryogenic oxygen and hydrogen. Super dense, super cold liquid packed in vacuum-insulated tanks at incredibly low temperatures of -300 and -400 degrees Fahrenheit. Cryogenics react with a catalyst in a fuel cell to produce electricity. And as a byproduct, they produce heat and pure water. So this is the energy, heat, and water resource we need to go to the moon, operate in the vicinity of the moon, and then return to Earth. So they're enormously important. 2 days into the mission, however, I've used some of these consumables. And if I could look inside the tank right now, I would see a two-phase condition, part liquid and part gas. And this results in unequal areas of pressure within the tank, so it's very difficult to manage pressure into the fuel cells and into the life support system. So the designers put fans inside the tanks we would turn on to stir this mixture up. And we had a heater that we used to raise the pressure. And that's what a cryo stir was all about. Fans on, heater on. Jack Swigert in the command module acknowledged our request for the stir. And he looked behind him, and coming through the tunnel from the lunar module was Fred Hayes. Swigert then threw 2 switches. Now, nothing happened for 16 seconds. And then the inside oxygen tank, too, a spark jumps between the fan and the heater assembly, and the pressure in that tank rises very rapidly over the next 6 seconds until it blows the dome of the tank off. When the dome came off the tank, the insulation surrounding it caught fire. And fed by the oxygen, it was like a blowtorch racing through the bay of the spacecraft, tearing out the instrumentation and the plumbing and the electrical systems. Shocking valves closed until the pressure increased to the point where it blew the side of the spacecraft off. When the side came off the spacecraft, the area surrounding it was enveloped in a cloud of debris from the explosion and frozen particles of oxygen. And we did not know an explosion had occurred. It's 55 hours, 55 minutes, and 4 seconds from launch. My voice loops come alive. Hey, flight, we've had a computer restart. The other controller says main bus undervolt. Third one says antenna switch. And then down from the spacecraft level calls, hey, Houston, we got a problem. What already had a bunch of problems reported to me, and I was wondering which one he was talking about. My controllers at that moment didn't know what to believe because none of their data made sense. The crew thought they had been hit by a meteor. And then we see the spacecraft start to tumble, so Lovell has to take over manual attitude control so he can keep his antennas pointed back towards Earth. And for about 60 seconds, my voice loops are literally chaotic with all the reports coming in. And then the training kicked in. The controllers started working a problem. We started voicing instructions up to the crew to restore many of the lost functions. So by 3 minutes, we've started the process of recovery, but all of the problems that remain fall upon a single controller by the name of Cy Liebergott. And Cy has the system's responsibility for those things you need to stay alive in space. Power, oxygen, pressure, heat, water. But I can't work with Cy because this tumbling motion has momentarily overcome Lovell's ability to control the spacecraft. Now we're driving towards a condition we call Gimbal Lock. If we get into this condition, we'll tumble our gyros. We'll lose our ability to communicate, point the spacecraft, perform maneuvers, find our way back to Earth. If we get into Gimbal Lock condition, we're literally going to be lost in space until we can go through the time-consuming and complex process of reordering our navigation system. Plus 20 minutes, Lovell looking outside the hatch window. And he says, hey, Houston, I see some kind of a gaseous substance out there. I believe we are venting our oxygen. All of a sudden, the pieces fit together. There had been an explosion on board the spacecraft with a lot of collateral damage. When I debriefed my controllers after the mission, they described their feeling at that instant as if they were just tumbling into a void. I was a fighter pilot. Fighter pilots in my day used the term looking into the eyes of a tiger. And this is the stark and the very lonely feeling that you get when the only thought on your mind is survival, and you're trying to find some way out of the box you're in. Well, I was the flight director. It's my job to lead, so I call my controllers up and say, okay, all flight controllers, settle down. Quit your guessing, let's start working this problem. Electrical bus A is still good. Don't do anything to screw it up. The lunar module's attached. We're going to use that as our lifeboat. Now get me some backup people in here and get me more computing and communications resources. Plus 30 minutes, my boss, Chris Kraft, comes in just as we're starting a series of emergency power downs. We're trying to buy some time, and Liebergott comes to me and he says, Flight, I want to shut down fuel cells 1 and 3. And I say, Si, we better think about that. And he says, nope, Flight, I think that's the only way we're going to stop these leaks. And I say, Si, are you ready for your final option? He says, yeah, Flight, it's time. Now, we have 3 fuel cells on board the spacecraft that produce all of the resources we need to fly to the moon, operate in the vicinity of the moon, and return to Earth. But the problem is, once they're shut down, they can never be restarted. Very reluctantly, I agree with Si to shut down 2 of the fuel cells. We voiced the instructions up to Jim Lovell in the spacecraft. We want to shut them down. The discussion with Jim is very short, very intense. And very reluctantly, he proceeds shutting down 2 of the fuel cells. And this is probably the lowest point of morale in the entire mission, because now I know there's no more going to the moon. We also know it's going to be darn tough, maybe impossible, to bring the crew of Apollo 13 home. Not through decisions yet, because we have to pick the return path. If I jettison the lunar module and use the big engine, I can be home in a day and a half. But something, some gut feeling, and that's all I got, says don't use that engine, it won't work. The other option, I'm going to have to go around the moon. It's going to take between 4 and 5 days to get back home. And to the best of my knowledge, I have only enough electrical power for 2 people for 2 days. And with nothing more than this gut feeling, I make the decision to bring the spacecraft around the moon. Call my controllers up and say, okay, flight controllers, listen up. Be advised that all mission planning will be around the moon. We will not, I repeat, we will not execute a direct abort. And this comes as a shock to many of the people because they believe this is the wrong decision. But they also know it is decision time, and they are the ones that must execute it. We voiced the instructions up to Jim Lovell in the spacecraft that we're going around the moon, and the discussion with Jim is very short, very intense. And he concurs that this is the direction we ought to take. It's now plus 1 hour. My team has finally accomplished handover to Lundy's team, and he is immediately challenged because the 3rd fuel cell is now failing, and lifetime on that cell is down to less than 15 minutes. So he scrambles the crew over the lunar module to complete the power-up. But most importantly, he has to transfer the navigation data from the command module computer, which is going to die, and put it over in the lunar module computer. We didn't have a data bus transfer capability in those days, and all the computations for this data are pencil and paper and slide rule, and they must be perfect. I'm walking downstairs to where my Tiger team is forming up. As I walk downstairs, I think we're literally going to have to do in minutes and hours what normally takes days and weeks. And we're going to be working outside all known design and test boundaries in the spacecraft. And I walk into this room. It's crowded, it's noisy, smoky, a lot of confusion because many of the controllers have just come in from their rest period. And at the blackboard, we list the problems we expect to see. Our batteries may freeze, water system may freeze, propellants may freeze, large number of survival issues. How do we navigate? How do we get back through the Earth's atmosphere? And when we finally finish listing this long list of must-dos, I give the team their direction. We have never lost an American in space, and we sure as hell aren't going to lose one now. This crew is coming home. You got to believe it. Your team must believe it, and we must make it happen. And from that moment forward, this team had their direction, over the next 4 days, they pulled off a miracle, bringing the crew of Apollo 13 home. It's now 2 hours after the explosion. We now focus on the three most immediate problems. John Aaron, a 26-year-old engineer from Oklahoma, is given the job to get us home and the consumables, resources, and the lunar module. John signs up to do the job, and he says, two things we got to do immediately, Flight. And I say, okay, what are they? He says, we got to cut a day off the return journey. And I say, okay, John, I'll work in that part of it. What's the other one? He says, well, what we got to do is we got to power down the navigation system, displays, and computer. And I say, John, that one's not in the cards. And he says, why, Flight? That's the biggest power user in the whole spacecraft. And I say, John, we normally navigate with stars, but with this debris cloud that is surrounding the spacecraft, we no longer can see stars. All we can clearly identify is the sun, the earth, and the moon. So Phil Schaffer, another one of the engineers in mission control, gets the job to come up with new ways to navigate using the sun, the earth, or the moon, and he has to come up with the techniques and the procedures within the next 18 hours before the spacecraft goes behind the moon. I take a third part of my team to come up with a way to cut a day off the return journey, and the basic approach is this. As the spacecraft passes behind the moon's gravity is going to pull it in an arc and orient its velocity vector back towards Earth. And at the proper place on that return trajectory, we're going to ignite the engine that we would have used to land in the moon. Only this time we're going to use it to increase our forward velocity by roughly about 1,000 feet per second. We now have our first press conference because the media believes the crew's lost. At the conclusion of the press conference, they're given the opportunity to come over into mission control. We set up a small booth over in the left-hand corner of my control room, patch in all of the voice communications, so from now on we're literally living in a fishbowl. Everything that we are saying and everything that we are doing is being reported live to the world as it is happening. Now, plus 10 hours after the explosion, teams have handed over one more time in mission control. Milt Windler's maroon team now has the helm. We got plenty of time to talk to the crew, so we're going through the events leading up to and after the explosion with the crew. But most importantly, we're trying to figure out what on board the damaged spacecraft will be useful in coming up with our return plans. It's now 24 hours after the explosion. The Get Home Fast maneuver is on board the spacecraft. Power management plan is in work. We figured out how to navigate using the sun. And as maneuver time approaches, it gets real quiet in mission control. Then the crew calls out engine start, and the engine's fishtailing. And I say, hey, Prop, what the heck's going on? He says, give it a few more seconds, Flight. Let's just watch it. And we watch that engine, settles down, starts thrusting correctly, burns for the next 4.5 minutes. And then the crew calls shutdown. And as soon as they finish, they start doing their post-burn report, and we immediately recognize our mistake. When we planned the maneuver, we assumed 2 crewmen would be in the lunar module and 1 crewman would be in the command module. Well, that assumption was wrong because all 3 crewmen had crowded into the lunar module to see what was going on. Well, from now on in mission control, there will be no more assumptions. Well, the maneuver cut a day off the return journey. It also changed our landing point. We're going to be landing in the Indian Ocean near Samoa, so we send the aircraft carrier Iwo Jima to the new landing location. Now the only management flap on Apollo 13 begins. Deke Slayton is the boss of the astronauts. Pretty tough customer. Comes up, leans over the console, says, look, I want you to get my crew to sleep. They're too darn tired. They're going to make a mistake. And about the time I got his input, my boss, Chris Kraft, says, nope, what you got to do is you got to get that spacecraft powered down. But the guy standing behind Kraft is Max Faget. He's chief of engineering. And Max says, nope, don't listen to those two. What you got to do is you got to restore thermal balance to the spacecraft. Well, that was the direction that we were already going because we'd been tracking temperatures for the previous 24 hours. On the sun side of the spacecraft, the temperature was plus 150 degrees. On the dark side, it was minus 80s, 180. So we had a total of 330-degree temperature difference from one wall of the spacecraft to the opposite wall of the spacecraft. And everything in the dark side is freezing up rock solid. Now, the only source of energy we have is the sun, so what we must do is invent a barbecue-type maneuver to spin the spacecraft perfectly on its axis so the sun can eat all sides, and we've never done this before. And this is probably one of the finest examples of teamwork and mission control I've ever seen. Literally for about 1 hour, we're literally conducting a physics experiment in space. We're trying to figure out which thruster, or sets of thrusters, or combinations of thrusters will set up this spin-up condition we need. After about an hour's work, we feel we got all the piece parts we need. We voice the instructions up to the crew. Crew executes the procedure, doesn't work. We look back over the procedure. We're convinced they must have missed one of the steps. So we tell them to try it one more time. And now the second time, it's working like a champ. The spacecraft is spinning perfectly on its axis, perpendicular to the sun line. Now we can get some rest. We've been operating continuously for about 60 hours, 2.5 days, working the problem. We can also power down the spacecraft. We bring it down to a level of about 100 watts, which is just enough to operate a small fan and provide power for communications. And we know it's going to get as cold as a meat locker inside the spacecraft. Now, while we're sleeping, engineering comes up with a solution to another problem we got, because our crew is about 10 hours from suffocating due to carbon dioxide poisoning. To clean the atmosphere in the spacecraft, we have a chemical canister that is packed with a set of crystals, lithium hydroxide, and this removes the carbon dioxide from the air and basically allows us to recycle our oxygen. But we only had enough of these canisters for 2 people for 2 days, so our crew is about 10 hours from expiring. We have plenty of square scrubbers, however, over in the DID command module. So engineering comes up with the idea of fabricating an adapter to fit the square scrubber in the round hole, using the cardboard cover from the flight plan, big plastic baggie that we had on board. We use a sock as a filter, some hoses, lash it all together with duct tape. Tested in the laboratories, it works like a champ. Voice the instructions up to the crew, and they build not 1 but 2 of these guys so they can clean the atmosphere as rapidly as possible. At the time this device came online, the crew was less than 5 hours from dying. About the time this device is online, my teams come in from our rest period, and the return status is not very encouraging. It's getting much colder in the spacecraft than we had expected it to, and our water system is freezing up, so we have the crew transferring water to baggies so they'll have something to drink and rehydrate the food. The Navy tells me a typhoon is building in the exact landing area I'm bringing the spacecraft back to, and they want me to change the landing point. But the problem that gets my attention is my trajectory team tells me we're going to miss the Earth. We're going to skip out trajectory. Now, when we fly back to Earth, we have to fly down a 2.5-degree wide cone-shaped corridor. If we come in too shallow, we're going to skip off the Earth's atmosphere and go into an eternal orbit between the Earth and the Moon. If we come in too steep, we're going to burn up in about 45 to 60 seconds, just like the shuttle Columbia did a few years ago. Now, we have no computer, we have no display system, but we have figured out a way to perform a maneuver. We tell the crew to rotate the spacecraft so they can see the Earth outside a telescope that's in the window in the lunar module. We use this telescope for rendezvous docking and for lunar navigation. And we tell Jim Lovell on the right side of the spacecraft, looking through this telescope, and basically align the y-axis crosshair on the Earth's terminator, which is the line between daylight and darkness. And we say, Jim, when the engine starts, you keep the engine moving up and down with your hand controller. And Fred Hayes, on your side of the spacecraft looking through your telescope, when the engine starts, you keep the Earth from moving from left to right. And we tell Jack Swigert to put 14 seconds in his wristwatch. And that is the entire procedure. Crew talks it over for a few minutes. Then we hear them call out engine start. And they're all over the place for the first few seconds, but they catch on to the control technique quick. 14 seconds later, we hear them call shutdown. And then we tracked the spacecraft for about a half hour after this maneuver, and doggone if it didn't work. We got the crew back within our proper reentry corridor. So now for the next 24 hours, the crew doesn't have anything to do but watch the Earth grow larger and larger and larger and wonder how we're going to get them back through the Earth's atmosphere. And here's what my problem is. I basically have 3 spacecraft up there. On the left-hand side is the lunar module. That's our lifeboat. The cone-shaped vehicle in the middle is the command module. That's our reentry vessel. And then the one on the right is the service module where the explosion occurred. The very last moment, as we're getting ready to enter into the Earth's atmosphere, we have to maneuver into an orientation so we can explosively separate these 3 pieces so they'll follow different reentry trajectories. But before we do that, we have to evacuate from the lunar module, get into the command module, rapidly and efficiently power it up, initialize computer, close hatch, check orientation, then start blowing the pieces apart. This will turn into a checklist on board the spacecraft that's about 500 entries long. I walk over the simulators at landing -24 to find out how things are going. Ken Mattingly, the astronaut scrub from the mission, and Gene Cernan and Tom Stafford are working the procedures for me. And they come up and they say, well, we think the procedures are ready to go. But one thing we'd like to do as a final cross-check, we'd like to give them to a crewman who has never seen them and to have them go through it a final time. And I agree that's a good final cross-check, so we reset the deadline to start voicing instructions up to the crew back to landing -18. And that's where we are right now. This is the first page of procedures that we executed with the crew at the start of entry day, and you can see we don't have any fancy word processing systems, but we do have configuration maintenance. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, you see we've gone through 4 versions of that over about a 5-hour period. At landing -18 now we start, that's what Fred Hayes' procedures look like. There's another one for Fred Hayes. That's one of the maneuvers he had to do. But we start voicing instructions up to the crew at landing -18. We work with Jack Swigert for about 2 hours. He reads the procedures back to us. We're convinced he understands what must be done. And then we start working with Fred Hayes. Jack's got all his stuff done in the command module. Fred's got to do the job in the lunar module. And unknown to us on the ground, Fred was pretty sick. He's totally dehydrated, bad urinary infection. He's got uncontrollable shivers that they call rigors. And but basically, he's the guy that has to do the job in the lunar module. So we work with him until he understands his part of the job. Then we powered it down to get a few hours rest before we come in for our final shift. And that's basically where we are right now. We're at landing -8 hours. I always have my controllers go off, get by themselves, get totally focused upon what they must do in this shift. When they're ready, they come in and give me a green light indication from their console. When they have an all-green board, I send my flight surgeon around to interview them to see if they're going to need a stimulant, keep them going for the final hours. Virtually all the controllers refuse. They're going to do it on black coffee and cigarettes. And basically, I put on my white vest, which has been my team's trademark since the early days in space, and pull my controllers for the start of the shift status. And the controllers report in. They're sharp to crisp. They're on top of the job. And I'm so darn proud of these kids I could croak. But I don't even have that luxury because one of my controllers comes up from the front row of consoles, leans over and says, "Flight, I hate to tell you this, we're going to miss the Earth. We must perform an emergency maneuver." Now we have no choice but to use some of our very precious electrical power. We voice the instructions up to the crew to load program 40 in the LEM guidance computer. We provide them the maneuver data. The crew executes that maneuver, and now we're scrambling, trying to find some way to make that electrical power we used. Now, throughout these final hours, the crew's guardian angels are these two. On the left-hand side is Ken Mattingly, the astronaut scrub from the mission. On the right, in the white shirt, is Joe Kerwin. He's my prime communicator. He's a medical doctor. He'll be the first doctor in space on the Skylab 2 mission. And Joe's bedside manner with this crew is absolutely spectacular. Time to jettison the damaged service module. And the crew calls out service module jettison. Then there's about a 45-second pause as they maneuver into position to give us a report. And then they start reporting, "Okay, I've got her. The whole side of the spacecraft's missing, all the way to the high-gain antenna. The whole side is missing to the base of the engine. And then Hayes says, yeah, it looks like it got the engine too. There's nothing out there but a dark brown streak by the injector. And in mission control, I'm thinking, listening to this report, and I'm thinking back to this decision that I made almost 4 days earlier, based on nothing but a gut feeling. And I cannot describe to you how intense that was. And many of my controllers have experienced there's some point in the mission where you've done absolutely the best you can for your crew. And then it's time to hand over to a higher authority to bring this mission to its ultimate conclusions. We now continue the power up in the spacecraft. There's water all over inside the spacecraft, hanging from the switches and circuit breakers, light bulbs, globs as big of silver dollar condensed moisture floating free in the atmosphere. And now in mission control, you can start feeling the emotional content is building because these controllers are sensing victory. And the emotional content peaks about the time that we jettison the lunar module because we speak to it and we say, farewell, Aquarius. We thank you. You were one hell of a good ship. And then we blow the explosive bolts. It's going to tumble and disintegrate before it hits the Pacific. And now it's time to run our final cross-check with the crew and verify their go for entry. And just as we start, I'm interrupted. Controller comes to me and he says, Flight, we got to get the crew quick. Battery C is failing. We need power for the parachutes. So we tell the crew to bring battery C offline, redistribute batteries A and B across the buses for the chutes. And now it's a real tough time to talk because the entire world is listening to everything that we are saying. And finally, the rookie astronaut on board the spacecraft calls down. He says, you know, all of us up here want to thank you guys down there for the great job you did. And then we get an attaboy from both Lovell and Hayes, and before we can respond, there's a burst of static. And we call Flight, we've had loss of signal. We're in blackout. Now, blackout is the time period where the fire of entry prevents communications with the crew. And at this stage in the space program, we could nail it within a second, and we've never missed. And blackout's very difficult for every controller because there's only one thought in every controller's mind. Did I give the crew everything I needed to? And it was my day to write. Because from now on, the crew is on their own. That's Milt Windler, Marine Flight Director. These are the bosses in the row of consoles directly behind me. And blackout affects everybody pretty much the same way. And every eye is on the clock on the walls. It counts down to zero. And when it finally hits zero, blackout should be over. And I say, okay, Joe, give him a call. And Kerwin calls Odyssey, Houston, standing by. And there's no response from the crew. And we call again, and we call again, and it's basically now 1 minute after we should have heard from the crew. Every controller is standing, staring at those clocks, wondering what in the heck went wrong. But in our business, we will never surrender. We keep calling. Finally, at 1 minute and 27 seconds after we should have heard, we got a ray of hope. Downrange aircraft calls our Raya 4 has acquisition of signal. And then the aircraft carrier reports radar contact, and then a sonic boom. And then in mission control, we see this beautiful picture of the spacecraft under these 3 red and white parachutes. And the emotional release at that instant is so intense that literally every controller is standing crying, and you're frankly embarrassed by your loss of composure, so you pull yourself together. Get back to work. Spacecraft hits the water, remains upright. The Iwo Jima circles, deploys more helicopters. The parajumpers go in the water to assist the crew out. And this crew that had been living in the meat locker, temperatures range from 35 to 37 degrees, extremely humid for 4 days, and all they had were those white cotton coveralls. But now these guys are in the warm air of the South Pacific, and they are home, and they are alive. Now, in our line of work, we basically don't start our celebration until we hand over responsibility for the crew to the Recovery Task Force commander. And as soon as this handover is complete, then we start our celebration. By now, we have pre-positioned about 800 of the finest cigars we can find. They run from the west coast of the United States all the way to the east coast of the United States. At some facilities, we told them to cut the cigars in half so more people could join in our celebration. And on national TV, we count down to light up these stogies. And this was the sweetest smoke I think any of us have ever had in our lives. Second phase in celebration is to back out of a condition we call battle short. During all critical mission phases, we physically block all power breakers coming into the building, and basically we lock the control room doors. Now we open the control room doors, and the real heroes of 13 come in and join us, because these are the folks who gave us the answers we needed when we needed them. All we did in the main control room was count cadence and assemble the pieces into the proper sequence. The third phase in celebration is to pass out an American flag to every controller. And we started this tradition when we set our first spaceflight record as Americans, and we continued it all the way through about the midpoint of the shuttle program. And on the staff of that flag, you write your name, you write the mission, you write the landing time, the job that you were doing in mission control. And it is truly one of our most treasured possessions. Well, President Nixon came down and visited the teams in mission control. We got some nice attaboys. And then 2 days later, he goes out to Hawaii to recognize the crew's performance. And I don't think there's any controllers ever worked with a better crew in their lives. A lot of times we're asked, what was really the key to this mission, key to success? Well, there are many keys, but to me, the one that was most important was the trust that existed between the teams on the ground and the crew in the spacecraft, because without this trust, we would have never been able to exercise the rapid changes in direction in the off-the-wall procedures that we developed. A few words about my flight directors. We always operated with 4 teams to balance the training workload, and actually that allowed us to pull a team out of the shift rotation at about the midpoint in the mission. But the most important reason, one team was always designated as a crisis management team, and that happened to be my responsibility for Apollo 13. When the problem occurred, I had to get my team out of the rotation, come up with the answers, and then return to the console to execute the exercises and the procedures that we had developed. Glenn Lenny on the left was the youngest of the flight directors at 32. I was the oldest at 37. Milt Wundler had the maroon team. Jerry Griffin had the gold. The remaining 3 of us were all fighter pilots. We flew the late subsonic and early supersonic aircraft in the 50s. And I believe it was this background in high-risk jet aviation that really gave us what we needed to keep our poise during the course of this mission. Our nation abandoned the moon in December 1972. Gene Cernan was the last human ever to walk on its surface. And for us, this was a marvelous time to live, because we believed in this dream that we were given by John F. Kennedy. And we considered ourselves privileged and proud to be part of the brotherhood that formed in the early years of spaceflight. And we thanked our country every day that they gave us a chance to participate in this great adventure. So this is the story of Apollo 13, story of mission control. But it's a story of a group of young people united under leadership, trust, and values to form a team that truly believes that in their line of work, failure is never an option. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Here we go, here. Okay, both sides. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, you got
Gene,
that?
thank you for your insightful presentation on the real-time problem solving in the worst of times to find a solution to be the best. After I heard you last year on September 12th on the 50th anniversary of JFK's speech, "We choose to go to the moon" at Rice, not to get you today on the Pearl Harbor Day to address us was never an option in our team's ops procedure.
Thank you.
You and our team members made it happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. There we go.
Thank you.
There we be.
Thank you.
See, thank you.
Gene has agreed to sign a few autographs and pictures taken at the backstage. So people, those who want to do it, you could join over there. The MC for the next event is Dan Ninan. Please welcome Dan. Thank you, folks. Appreciate it.